And then I'll be in dialogue with Dr. Park and be able to take, I hope, many of the questions that you have, because when I looked at even some of the early questions that were sent to me through the Samsung Press Foundation, what struck me right away is these are exactly the same questions that journalists in the United States are asking right now. Young journalists are asking them, and also old journalists like me are asking them. So I know that the conversation we're having together is absolutely important, and I hope that it will be the beginning of a fruitful and mutually helpful ongoing dialogue. And I hope that someday I'll see some of you young people as my graduate students at Columbia. I have to say that I've had, over my almost 30 years there, a number of outstanding Korean and Korean American students. So the path has been open for you when you want to come to Columbia. But now to speak more formally. In the late summer of 1969, when I was 13 years old and starting high school, my mother gave me my first typewriter. It was a heavy iron black machine that required me to strike the keys very forcefully. My mother thought I should start typing up my assignments for school, which I did, but I also used that typewriter to write the first articles I submitted to my high school newspaper. The funny thing is that I never learned how to type correctly. Back in 1969, in my high school, you could only take a typing class if you were a girl training to be a secretary. I was in a curriculum aimed at academic preparation for college, so I had no choice but to teach myself to type. For the first year or so, I did it with one finger, the index finger on my left hand, since I am left-handed. Then I was able to start using the index finger of my right hand, a great step forward for me. At one time toward the end of my high school years, I bought an instruction book with diagrams of the keyboard and exercises to teach you how to type with it, with all 10 fingers. It was a method called touch typing. But the process of following the diagrams and doing the exercises made me so slow that I reverted back to my 2 fingers. I am now 63 years old, and I still type with just 2 fingers. And I still hit the keys with a lot of force. Several times when I've been typing on an airplane flight, the passenger in front of me has turned around to ask me to stop typing so noisily. Over my years as a journalist, my way of typing is one of the few parts of my professional life that has stayed constant. I've gone from newsrooms that used early desktop computers to some of the first portable computers, which weren't even called laptops yet, to the era of smartphones, the internet, and social media. I've gone from being part of a news industry in the United States that was intensely concentrated in 3 major television networks, several general interest magazines with circulations in the tens of millions, and dominant national newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I've gone from that to a news industry that is splintered and fragmented into an immense and ever-growing number of publications, most of which operate online. It can be reassuring for me to still type up my own articles with 2 fingers, because that simple action reminds me that even as so many elements of journalism have changed with advances in technology and changes in the marketplace, some important aspects of our work should not change. A former colleague of mine at Columbia Journalism School, Professor Sig Gisler, who is also the administrator in charge of the Pulitzer Prizes, created a word to describe the ideal mix of old and new. He said today's journalist should be tradigital. You cannot find that word in any dictionary. Professor Gisler made it up. But here's what it means. Tra is from the word traditional. And digital is, of course, the word we use when we talk about digital technology, the digital revolution, and so on. Professor Gisler's tradigital journalist is someone who keeps the best part of the journalistic tradition while also being familiar with the newest technologies and making use of them to gather and share news. At my age, I have many longtime friends in journalism who complain that the internet, social media, cable television, YouTube, etc., are ruining journalism. They think the professionals have been outnumbered by the amateurs. They complain about the number of journalists who've been laid off from their jobs and the number of newspapers that have closed down. These complaints do have some merit, but for most of my years as a professional journalist, there has always been a sense that the good old days are over, that the golden age was somewhere in the past. For example, after I graduated from college in 1977, I had a summer job on the Minneapolis Star. At that time, Minneapolis had two competing newspapers. The Tribune published in the morning and the Star in the afternoon. It was very typical for major American cities back then to have at least two newspapers. But the growing audience for evening newscasts on television was reducing the number of readers and buyers for afternoon newspapers. Many of them began to close. And in 1982, the Minneapolis Star became one of them. I was not on the paper then, but a friend of mine saved the last edition for me. In it, one of the Star's columnists wrote in a very emotional tone that when you see afternoon newspapers closing and major cities having only one daily newspaper, then you know that American journalism is dying. Well, here we are 41 years later, and journalism is not dead at all. Yes, there have been closings and layoffs, but thanks to the digital revolution, there are also hundreds or even thousands of journalism startups that are hiring tens of thousands of young reporters, editors, photographers, web designers, and videographers. In the early 1980s, when I was working on a newspaper in the suburbs of Chicago, I had to drive to the one local store that carried the Sunday edition of the New York Times if I wanted to read it on a Sunday. If I was just a few minutes too late, all of the 5 copies would have been bought already, and there was no New York Times for me. Now, thanks to the digital revolution, I can read the New York Times on my laptop or my smartphone. It's a Samsung. on my smartphone virtually anywhere in the world. When the London subway was bombed in 2005, I could read coverage instantly from the BBC and The Guardian. When Israel and Hezbollah fought a war in the summer of 2006, I could read the coverage from both Lebanese and Israeli English language newspapers while sitting at my desk in Manhattan. The access all of us have now is extraordinary. And the digital tools to report are extraordinary too. The movement against police brutality in the United States, called the Black Lives Matter movement, was made possible by the use of smartphones. Civilians who witnessed or experienced brutality from police officers were able to make video recordings, which were then made available to journalists. Search engines like Google, if used wisely, have made it far more efficient to do research. Being online is like having membership in the world's largest and greatest library. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter allow journalists to locate sources almost anywhere in the world and to publish their work to a global audience. So I'm convinced that more great journalism is being produced now than at any time that I've ever lived, and probably at any other time in human history. And the efforts of President Trump to attack the American media as the enemy of the people and to call our product fake news have had an unexpected effect. Yes, many of his supporters believe him, but much of the public values a free press more than ever before, because it feels endangered. Online subscriptions for newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have grown rapidly in the Trump years. And many of my students at Columbia have gone into journalism precisely because the president's campaign against journalism and journalists proves to these young people, and maybe to you too, how important and necessary the news media is. There is a phrase in American journalism, there's a phrase rather in American jargon, that you can look at a glass of water as being half full or half empty. I've just given you the half full version of journalism in the digital era. Now, let me give you the half empty version. By that, I mean the challenges posed to journalism by the digital revolution. In terms of the economics of the news industry, the digital revolution has created a far more competitive market than ever before and has disrupted the revenue streams that had sustained major newspapers and magazines. Classified advertising, the small ads about an apartment to rent or a bicycle for sale, things like that. Classified advertising has moved to free sites like Craigslist. Display advertising from large businesses like airlines, restaurants, and clothing stores was placed in targeted online portals rather than on printed pages in publications. Readers who used to have no choice but to pay for a publication if they wanted to read it could now click their way to free views online. Or more recently, they follow Twitter tweets or Facebook posts to the articles that interest them. It is no wonder then that news organizations have struggled to find new ways to financially survive. At the outset of the digital era, some tried paywalls, which failed largely because consumers were not yet accustomed to paying simply to view content on a computer. Then, news organizations tried making all their content free and available in the hope that so many readers would come to the website that advertisers would follow. But not enough advertisers in enough volume ever did follow. Instead, many put their ads on aggregating sites like Yahoo rather than on any news organization's own site. And finally, in the last few years, major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post have succeeded with partial paywalls that offer a very low starting price, usually about $1 a week, and access to about 10 articles a month free. But newspapers without the national or international impact of the Times or the Post have not had similar success. The challenge to the traditional business models during the digital era has been paralleled by the challenge to traditional journalistic standards. In the United States, you need a license and a specific course of study to take on many occupations: doctor, lawyer, real estate agent, teacher, financial advisor, even cosmetologist. But there has never been any form of licensing or required education for journalists. The advantage of that lack of control is that the government cannot use licenses as a way of restricting freedom of the press. The disadvantage is that it has been left up to journalists themselves to establish best practices and ethical standards. When the news media was more concentrated just 20 or 25 years ago, it was easier to establish an informal consensus. That consensus believed that journalists should be impartial and nonpartisan, should accurately and honestly report facts, and should restrict opinion to clearly marked opinion pages. News organizations as a whole saw their role as helping to create the informed citizens who are necessary for a healthy democracy. Needless to say, the news media often fell short of those goals, but at least there was a good faith effort to meet them. There's an old joke that says freedom of the press belongs only to people who can afford to buy a printing press. And it is true that in the pre-internet years, it took a tremendous amount of money to operate a newspaper or a magazine or radio station or a TV station. Diverse voices were not present. The voice of American journalism then was the voice of the straight white male. But on the other hand, amateurs and ideologues could not as easily set up shop. The digital revolution changed all of that. Anyone able to design a website, or later to open up a social media account, could start functioning as a journalist. And online, that person's work would be as readily accessible as the work of a trained, experienced, professional journalist on a respected, long-standing news organization. Some startup sites were terrific. Others were deeply flawed, inaccurate, barely edited, poorly written. And still others were essentially political or ideological movements pretending to be news organizations. The former senator and diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, "Everybody is permitted to his own opinion, but nobody is permitted to his own facts." Everybody is entitled to his own opinion, but nobody is entitled to his own facts. Unfortunately, in the era of online journalism and social media, at least in the United States, a great many people believe they are entitled to their own facts. My nation is deeply divided these days, more divided than I've ever seen it in my life, in part because there is no longer a national narrative, a set of public facts and truths. Liberals and Democrats tend to rely on carefully edited and fact-checked news organizations like The Times, The Post, CNN, and National Public Radio. But conservatives and Republicans get their information primarily from right-wing media such as Breitbart, Fox News, and the Daily Caller. At the level of the individual journalist, the challenge of being tradigital is to hold on to the values we consider sacred, even when those values are under attack, especially when those values are under attack. We must be more committed than ever to searching out and verifying facts. We must be vigilant in putting aside our own political beliefs when reporting on issues. We must not let opinion seep into news coverage. We must always remember, in this time when every news organization is on deadline every second of every day, competing against every other news organization in the world, we must remember that it is better to get a story right than it is to upload a story first. Factual errors fly around the internet instantaneously, and even if they are later corrected, the damage caused by inaccurate information cannot be undone. After two terrorists set off a bomb at the Boston Marathon several years ago, a totally unfounded rumor went around online that a particular college student was a suspect. Legitimate professional journalists for several TV networks retweeted and forwarded that report, which made it seem even more legitimate. In fact, the college student was missing from his family and was later found to have committed suicide. He had absolutely nothing to do with the bombing. The ease of doing research online is a great boon to journalism, but also a potential trap. In cyberspace, we do not know who we're really talking to. That problem became especially vivid during the early months of the peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. A lot of news organizations in Europe and the United States did not keep reporters in Syria, partly because of the cost and partly because of the danger. So when a blogger using the name Gay Girl in Damascus started posting the inside story of political activists like herself, publications began quoting her dispatches without ever confirming her identity. Then one day, the cousin of Gay Girl in Damascus posted through the account that the blogger had been arrested and taken away by the Syrian secret police. The cousin asked Western journalists to demand the release of Gay Girl, and many news organizations did so. Only then did a few skeptics try to determine who Gay Girl in Damascus actually was. Her online photo, it turned out, had been stolen from the social media account of another woman. Gay Girl in Damascus was finally revealed to be a straight white guy from America who had created the online persona because he felt sympathetic to the pro-democracy demonstrators. I don't blame him for being a fake. I blame us journalists for being too complacent to make sure a gay girl was real. So both the opportunities and the obstacles abound for doing responsible and ethical journalism in the digital era. But one thing I do know is that when something is scarce, it becomes more valuable. That is the economic principle of supply and demand. And when our readers, viewers, and listeners feel surrounded by versions of journalism that are blatantly biased or indifferent to accuracy and factuality, they will value the best kind of journalism more than ever. And we are, you are, the very fortunate people who can provide it to them. Thank you.
안녕하세요. 진행을 맡은 이화연의 박상입니다. 오늘의 주인공이신 새9회 교수님 다시 한번 소개해드립니다. Thank you very much for being here with us today and for inspiring speeches now. I would like to use the text in my writing class. Would you allow me to introduce yourself again in my version? 제가 다시 한번 소개를 좀 드리겠습니다. 앞서 민정이사께서 소개를 해주셨지만 우리 프리드먼 교수님을 소개하는 여러 수식어들이 있습니다. 근데 아마 저한테 한마디로 교수님을 소개해라라고 한다면 저는 진짜 언론인이다 이렇게 소개를 드리고 싶어요. 요즘 같은 미디어 시연에서 우리는 정말 여러 종류의 언론과 다양한 종류의 언론인들을 보고 삽니다. 그 중에는 적당한 진짜와 적당한 가짜들이 섞여 있죠. 아마도 대부분은 그러나 우리 사회에서 언론이라는 게 어떤 역할을 해야 하는지 고민하고 또 진짜 언론이 되기 위해서 많은 고민과 함께 해답을 찾기 위해 노력하는 분들이라고 생각합니다. 그리고 오늘 이 자리에 오신 분들, 특히 신청을 하셔서 오신 분들은 그런 의문을 가지고 또 뭔가 해답을 찾으러 오셨다고 생각을 합니다. 그런 분들에게 가장 현명한 길을 제시해 주실 가장 적절한 분을 모셨다고 저는 생각합니다. 조금 더 소개를 드리면요. 여기 아까 고등학교 시절에 이제 타이프라이터를 가지고 기자를 시작하셨다고 했는데 사실은 하이스쿨이라고 하셨는데 주니어 하이거든요. 그게 중학교예요. 우리로 치면 8학년입니다. 중2. 그러니까 대부분의 학생들이 중2병을 앓을 때 그때 언론계에 입문을 하셨습니다. 그리고 그때 이제 어머니께서 주신 타이프라이터를 사용하셨다고 했는데 그 어머니께서 원래 언론인이 되시고 싶어 했다고 합니다. 그리고 18살에 처음으로 인턴 기자가 되셔서 처음 월급을 받는 기자로 언론계에 들어오신 후에 지금까지 언론인으로 또 언론을 가르치는 교수님으로 칼럼니스트로 어서로 활동을 해오셨습니다. 근데 지금까지 8권의 책을 쓰셨는데요. 그 책들은 전부 non-fiction 단행본, 그러니까 미국 사회의 그 어떤 깊은 문제점들을 파고들어서 치열하게 취재하고 그 다음에 아주 명료한 글로 써낸 저널리즘의 정수가 담긴 그런 책들입니다. 그래서 이제 지금은 이제 컬럼비아 대학 저널리즘 스쿨에서 미디어 윤리 그리고 non-fiction book writing이라는 과목을 가르치시고 있다고 합니다. 제가 첫 질문은요, 좀 가벼운 질문으로 시작할까 합니다. 중학교 2학년 때 언론계 입문을 하셨는데 어떤 어린 시절을 보내셨기에 그렇게 이른 나이에 험한 언론계에 들어오실 생각을 하셨는지, 어떠한 어린이였는지 좀 그 어린 시절에 대해서 말씀을 해주시죠.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Dr. Park, thank you so much. And as you said yourself, part of the reason I went into journalism. Okay. Okay, now I will start over, I apologize. Dr. Park, as you yourself said, my mother was someone who wanted to be a journalist. She grew up in a poor working family as the eldest child during the Depression. And so although she was able to go to college, instead of being able to study to become a journalist, she had to work days, go to school at night, and take a more practical course, which became business. So I felt even as a child some of the incentive of fulfilling her dreams for her life. But also, more generally, both of my parents were very avid about following political issues. It was the year of the Vietnam War, of the Civil Rights Movement. These things were discussed at our dinner table at home every day. And my brother and sister and I, if we had something intelligent to say, were encouraged to join the adult conversations. So I had an awareness of the larger world from really 9 or 10 years old. And interestingly also, the first job I ever had was to deliver the local newspaper. And it happened to be during the year 1968, which was a very traumatic, difficult year in America, a year with the most deaths in the Vietnam War, a year when Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both assassinated. And it was very powerful as I would go every afternoon after school and deliver the 70 newspapers I delivered in my hometown, to see both how people depended on getting the news and sometimes how crushing it was for them to get the news. But people I knew would look in the newspaper right after I gave it to them at the list of that week's casualties in the Vietnam War to see if someone they knew had been killed. The day Robert Kennedy was killed, a mother who I delivered the newspaper to had tears in her eyes and said to me, how can they even put out the newspaper today? Because the tragedy was so awful. And so I think that also gave me a real sense of the importance of journalism at this very young age. And in terms of what kind of kid I was, I didn't feel like I was such an unusual kid, except unusual in the sense that at age 13 I had already figured out pretty much what I wanted to do with my life. But I was a kid who liked to play sports and, listen to the radio, for music and, not wear braces and all that.
And reading as well, right?
And reading very avidly.
I liked the incident where you had to read a newspaper in a car to your daddy.
Yes, thanks for reminding me. My father worshipped the New York Times. And often he would take my brother and I on trips to go skiing, and it took us about 3 or 4 or 5 hours to go from our part of New Jersey up to where the mountains were. And on the way, he would often give me the New York Times from that morning and tell me which articles to read aloud to him. And so that also gave me this real appreciation for journalism. And I think in a way I didn't even realize at the time, when you're reading good writing aloud, it's a way of teaching yourself how to write.
부모님께서 정말 큰 역할을 하신 것 같다는 생각을 저도 했습니다. 제 말씀을 듣고. 2006년도에 교수님께서 쓰신 Letters to a Young Journalist, 그 책이 우리나라에도 2년 후에 2008년에 번역이 돼서 많은 독자들을 끌었고 또 많은 공감을 불러일으켰습니다. 그 책이 중국어로도 번역이 됐다고 합니다. 이제 교수님께서는 미국 분이시고 또 미국 언론 환경에서 이 책을 집필하신 걸로 알고 있습니다. 그래서 이 Letters to Young Journalist라는 글을 쓰실 때는 그 Young Journalist 안에는 한국이나 중국의 저널리스트는 없었을 것 같습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 이런 언어와 그 문화적인 장벽을 넘어서서 그들의 공감을 얻게 한 어떤 저널리즘의 보편성이 있는 것 같아요. 그게 무엇인지 좀 듣고 싶습니다.
Well, first of all, it's one of the great joys and surprises of my writing life that Letters to a Young Journalist was translated and published here in Korea as well as in China. I've written 8 books. This is the only one of my books to be translated into any other language. And I'm just incredibly moved to find out that the book has had such an effect here. I met my Korean publishers tonight and found out that it's in the 7th printing here, which just astonishes me. I feel like I won't need a plane to get home. I'll just walk on air on the way back.
Please don't.
But that's a good motherly warning. But I think we found that there are a great many things in common. I think, first of all, both of our countries, and I think many countries around the world, feel like they're in a period of deep and intense political debate right now. And they look, hopefully, to journalists, to responsible professional journalists, to be a trusted voice. That if they feel, and this is certainly true in the United States, that the political dialogue of the country is often so poisonous, so hard to believe, that there is a desire to find someone who is believable. So I think that's one area of common interest between us. The other is that Korea, like the United States, has been very much remade by the digital revolution, by the internet, now by social media, by all sorts of platforms. And we don't even know what's going to be invented, tomorrow or a year from now. And I think what I've learned in talking to Korean journalists and journalism professors, even on this short trip, and from some of the questions that came to me from some of you beforehand, is that a lot of the challenges that the digital revolution has posed in America are identical to the challenges here. The challenges of what will be the business model for the news industry moving forward. The challenge of what's the point of being a professional, ethical, responsible journalist if anybody can throw up a website or start blogging and pretend to be a journalist. The challenge of sifting through all the information that's out there online and trying to, in a really rigorous way, verify what's truthful and what's not, or what's fully true and what's partially true, or what's factually true but presented with a bias. Those are great challenges that I'm now aware we completely share across 2 continents and with an ocean dividing us. And maybe it's because the practice of journalism itself, and this is one of the very good parts of the digital revolution, has become a truly global conversation. Because we can read each other's work, listen to each other's work, watch each other's work through the miracle of the internet, it gives us a sense that we're in a shared profession facing shared problems, but also with some incredible shared rewards. And it has really erased the miles between us.
그런 기술이 가져다주는 어떤 공통점도 있지만 아무래도 저널리즘이라는 것이 그 인간이 진실을 추구하고자 하는 본능이 있고요. 또 그것을 위한 제가 제일 좋아하는 그 책 중에 프레이즈가 저널리스트는 honest broker of information이다. 정직한 브로커다, 정보의. 그런 정직한 정보를 가져다주는 사람은 찾는 사회의 속성이 공통이 돼서 그런 게 아닌가 생각이 듭니다. 교수님께서 인간성을 굉장히 강조하시는데 그 인간성이라는 것이 사실 나라와 관계없이 다 저널리즘이 추구하는 하나의 목표가 아니기 때문인가 이렇게 생각이 듭니다. 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
Well, I completely agree that it's a shared objective for all of us. And when you meet journalists who are trying to do their work in countries around the world that are not free or not fully free, it makes you appreciate how much all journalists look to those of us in free media countries like the United States and Korea or England or France and so on, look to us as beacons for them of what they want journalism in their countries to be. I've had students at Columbia come out of deeply repressive countries, Syria, Iraq, Tajikistan, and some of them have had to go into hiding because of their journalistic work. One of my Iraqi students had his father disappeared by a death squad in retaliation for the work he was doing. And that's inspiring, and it lets us know that truly all journalists around the world are part of something larger. And it really unites us at a time when other people would like to pit nation against nation and make it this period of, nationalistic antagonism, when I think part of our role is to keep the global conversation going. To go back to your earlier point about being an honest broker, I think that's the great intellectual challenge of being an ethical journalist. And it's a real human challenge as well. It's often human nature to want to be with the people we agree with. It's human nature to want to hear things that we agree with. It's human nature to want to just go on Facebook and put a bunch of likes on things that you like. I understand that. I'm as prone to that human nature as anyone else is. But what the idea of the journalist being an honest broker holds up as a higher value is what if you can lay aside your own beliefs just long enough to hear what somebody else believes and to take it seriously and to treat it honorably. This is a high, high value. It was mentioned that I am a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Wisconsin had a great motto that speaks to the same desire to pursue truth wherever it takes you. And you have to understand, Wisconsin traditionally is a very agricultural state, because this metaphor in this phrase has to do with what you do with grain after you've harvested it, okay? To get to the kernels of grain, the part that you would make bread and make flour out. But the University of Wisconsin said that its mission, and the mission for its students, was to sift and winnow in the pursuit of truth. In other words, there are a lot of ideas out there. There are a lot of pseudo-ideas out there. There's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of facts out there. There are a lot of factoids out there. You have to make your way through all of that as a journalist and try with great intellectual honesty to find the facts and the truth within it, to resist the urge to only go to an ideological place that's already comfortable to you, or to resist the urge to have your conclusion before you have done any of the research.
제가 어떻게, 이 질문 중에 하나에도 그런 게 있었습니다. 어떻게 언론이 정직함을 유지하면서 제대로 보도할 수 있을까? 정직함에 대한 질문들이 있었는데 제가 사전에 한번 여쭤봤어요. 정직함에 대한 생각을 여쭤봤는데 두 가지 레벨에서 말씀하셨습니다. 첫 번째 정직함이라는 것은 you said before, 아버지한테 집에서 배우는, 부모님한테 배우는 그런 종류의 정직함이 있고요. 또 하나는 이제 사회에 나와서 지금 방금 말씀하신 intellectual honesty라는 말씀하셨습니다. 지적인 정직함을 우리는 획득해야 한다. 그러니까 기자라는 직업이 그 지적인 정직함을 추구하면서 치열하게 그것이 무엇일지 고민해야 하는, 거짓말을 하나 안 하나 이런 차원의 거짓말이 아니라, 그런 차원의 고민이 아니라 그런 말씀을 해주셨고요. 그런 부분은 사실은 나라와 문화와 관계없이 또 디지털과 아날로그와 관계없이 관통하는 어떤 저널리즘의 기본 덕목이 아닌가 생각을 합니다. 오늘 주제가 디지털 시대의 언론인의 윤리입니다. 그래서 이제 디지털로 좀 넘어와 볼까 합니다. 디지털 관련해서 많은 그 이야기들을 할 수 있을 것 같고 또 질문도 많이 있었습니다. 여러 질문이 있는데 우선 이제 아까 스피치에서 여러 그 half full version and half empty version. I'd like to ask you just one. 그 중에서 가장 큰 위협은 무엇이고 가장 큰 기회는 무엇인지 그거 좀 듣고 싶어요. 많은 말씀하셨는데.